EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Each year at EWA's national seminar, Scott Jaschik, editor and co-founder of Inside Higher Ed, shares his top 10 list of stories to watch for in the coming academic year. He's back with us again now with his cheat sheet to the higher ed beat. Scott, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thanks, Emily. It's always great to be on EWA Radio.
Well, great to have you. Before we get to the story ideas, I'd like to talk about some of the overarching themes that are on your list this year. One of them, obviously, is the influence of the Trump administration on both campus policy and campus life. Let's start there.
Sure. So there are some things where Trump is having a big impact, others less so. After the budget deal was reached, Congress appropriated more money for student aid and for research than many expected it would. So I don't think there's a big Trump impact there. In fact, it's much more generous than Trump proposed. But in other areas, we're seeing a big impact. Declining new international student enrollment, which very much relates to his visa policies and to his rhetoric fighting with countries all over the world. And very poor race relations on campus. I think President Trump, by virtue of the way he talks about people and groups, seems to have emboldened many people to say things that they might not have said before. And that is contributing to a tense environment on many campuses.
I think we're also seeing some of that tension in student protests, both to federal policies that directly impact university life and those ones that are more societal.
Absolutely. I mean, we're seeing protests over issues of racial tensions. We're seeing protests over society as a whole. I mean, right now, President Trump is very focused on the taking a knee movement in the NFL, but that was also present on campuses where many students feel very strongly that that was a worthy protest that should be protected by free speech rights. President Trump speaks about the importance of protecting free speech, but that seems to be an exception in his mind.
One of the themes that you've alluded to that I want to dig into here is that idea of unpopular speech on campus. Let's talk about that.
Absolutely. And we're also seeing a lot of debate and discussion over what to do about campus speakers who maybe nobody has invited. It was last summer that we saw the tragic events in Charlottesville, where white supremacists marched through the UVA campus, making certain chants and violating university rules in various ways. We've seen a lot of debate over how to ensure student safety without limiting free speech. And this gets very tricky. Many universities seem to be edging toward limiting rights for groups that nobody invited, as opposed to groups that some student or faculty member did invite.
You're also recommending that reporters look at community colleges. While those were a big piece, certainly, of President Obama's education policies, it seems that President Trump has expressed some confusion about what role those schools actually play.
President Trump, for about 4 times over the course of a month, made statements that I don't know what community colleges are, they should just focus on vocational ed, and he questioned whether they were doing a good job. A lot of ironies here. One is that, of course, community colleges do vocational ed, but in much of the country, state systems depend on community colleges to provide the first 2 years of a baccalaureate degree. In fact, if community colleges stopped doing pre-transfer education, you would see a radical drop in the number of bachelor's degrees awarded in states like Texas and California and Florida. There just are not enough spots in the 4-year institutions. How much of this is the Trump administration not liking anything associated with the Obama administration? Who knows? President Trump also has talked about apprenticeships, seemingly unaware that, in fact, community colleges run apprenticeship programs. Community colleges are very much jack-of-all-trades institutions in that they vary from campus to campus, but almost all of them have some programs focused on short-term career needs and other things focused on transfer, and that seems to be what their states and communities want.
One story idea that I have for reporters is to look at community colleges and see what some of the most popular career programs are. Where are the waiting lists? I'm thinking about things like the nursing programs. And then look at nearby for-profit colleges and see what students are paying to get essentially the same degree at a much higher price.
Absolutely. And in fact, not just nursing, but almost all of the health professions programs at community colleges, I think of as almost miracle worker programs because the students who come out of those programs frequently go from being poor to being in the middle class. There is such demand in these fields. And community colleges are turning away students because they don't have enough space. And these programs cost much less at a community college than at a for-profit. Most of them have very good completion rates, state licensure rates. And yes, they are vocational. And yet you can also see sort of the false dichotomy there, and this is worth writing about. Many people who start off with an associate degree in nursing, then work for a few years, then go back and get a bachelor's degree to advance their careers. So the idea that it's either vocational or it might lead to a bachelor's degree is a false either-or switch.
We're talking with Scott Jaschik of Inside Higher Ed about his story predictions for the coming academic year. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback will help us grow. Scott, your reputation as a prognosticator on the higher ed beat is well known. One of your big predictions for the coming year has to do with smaller colleges that may be at risk of closing. Let's talk about that.
Small private colleges, many of them are in trouble. Now, I'm not talking about your Swarthmores or Williams with your billion-dollar endowments, but small colleges without much of an endowment are really struggling these days. I talked about Mount Ida, which had just closed, or Atlantic Union, or Concordia, Alabama, that had just closed, or Wheelock, which merged into BU. But the day after I presented this at EWA, Merrillhurst outside of Portland, Oregon, announced it was closing. This is a very important issue, I think, for reporters, because private colleges are much less public than their public counterparts in the information they release. But when these colleges announce they're closing, there's truly a consumer issue. When Mount Ida closed, it had just accepted students to enroll in the fall. Same with some of these others. So I think while the red flags vary, generally if you're looking at a poorly endowed college, particularly those under 1,500 or under 1,000 enrollment, these days these are tough times for those institutions, and I would be looking into their finances.
On the other end of the spectrum, let's talk about some schools with big endowments or at least very generous donors. You've suggested one story idea might be to look at the strings that are attached to some of those gifts.
It's a wonderful thing for colleges when they get big gifts, but we are seeing more cases where the strings attached run counter to academic traditions. We wrote and others wrote about George Mason University, where it turned out that the Koch brothers foundations were playing a role in the selection and review of faculty members. This is generally considered a no-no. We wrote about UNLV, where a gift basically required the university to keep its med school dean and the president. Big surprise, this gift was approved by the president, who, for related reasons, is no longer the president. We wrote about UC Irvine, which got a $200 million gift. That's a very large gift, but it was to support integrative medicine that not all of the medical professors felt was truly the cutting edge medicine. This is a tricky issue for colleges because many of them need generous donors, but a gift to a college can legitimize something and may or may not be consistent with the college's mission. I would encourage reporters when they see a big gift announced to not just go with, oh, wow, this is great, but to look at what the money's going for and any terms and conditions attached.
In addition to some story ideas for reporters to go ahead and do, you do have some don'ts. And one of those you want to spike is that sort of perennial story about how tough it is to get into elite schools. Some of them you've already named.
Well, so first of all, it's still true. It's still tough to get into elite schools. But frankly, you could just save that story. It will be hard to get into Harvard this year, next year, and for the next 30 years. The main reason, though, I discourage those is I actually think there is more movement and change when you look at how it is becoming more difficult to get into, say, the Cal States or CUNY. On the one hand, this is wonderful because people are realizing the high quality of education and frequently affordable education available there. But we're seeing a closing out of students who never were going to go to Stanford or Berkeley, but who in the past had good options at Cal State. Many state systems haven't kept up with the population booms in their state, so students aren't getting in. That's the real story, not that it's hard to get into Stanford.
Well, while we're talking about admissions, how do you feel about waiting list stories?
Waiting lists are a good story because there's a lot of evidence that waiting lists are getting out of control. Many colleges this year, we reported, have waiting lists that are larger than their freshman class. Now, the reality is, of course, people don't do waiting lists with a rank order, like you're the first person let in, you're the second, but use them in case certain groups of students don't enroll. None of your football athletes enrolled. Well, go to the waiting list and see who's on the football team. It's very hard to get in off the waiting list at many institutions. I think one story is obviously just to talk to students about their frustrations being on waiting lists. A lot of experts think that it delays the time for the student to get over that he or she didn't get into first choice school, but probably is going to be just fine. And then there's the questions about transparency. How many colleges tell students on the waiting list, this is how long the list is? How many tell them, it's been 10 years since we let in somebody on the waiting list? In theory, waiting lists are fine, but I fear they just prolong the period of uncertainty for students who maybe would be better served if they just got excited about the colleges that let them in.
Scott, every year at National Seminar, your session is one of our most popular. And you walk in, it's standing room only, everybody's scribbling furiously. I got to ask you, why do you do it? Why not just keep this secret and say, okay, this is what Inside Higher Ed is going to cover for the year?
If I'm going to be honest, and on EWA Radio I must be honest, mostly I cover things I think Inside Higher Ed has covered well. So I have maybe my secret list of things that we're still working on, and hopefully by my next top 10 presentation, we'll have covered them well, and I'll share them with everyone too.
Scott Jaschik is the co-founder and editor of Inside Higher Ed and joins us from his office in Washington, D.C. Scott, thank you.
Thank you, Emily.
And thank you, everybody. If you want to read the full list of Scott's story ideas from National Seminar, you can go to ewa.org and read the blog post. We'll put a link to it up on the EWA Radio page as well. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thanks for listening.